At 82, Chuck Norris is done staying silent. For decades, the action legend let rumors swirl about rivalries, betrayal, and what really happened behind Hollywood's closed doors. But now, in a raw, emotional interview, he finally tells the truth. From clashes with Jean-Claude Van Damme to moral standoffs with Alec Baldwin and quiet tension with Shia LaBeouf, Norris reveals the moments that tested his code of honor. This isn't about scandal, it's about legacy, about standing for something when others wouldn't. The man behind the myth is speaking up, not to settle scores, but to set the record straight, once and for all, breaking the silence. At 82 years old, Chuck Norris sat down in a rare, emotional interview, and for the first time in decades, he didn't hold back. After a lifetime of silence, the martial arts legend who built his brand on stoicism, strength, and old-school honor chose this moment to finally speak the truth. There were no roundhouse kicks, no rehearsed lines, just a man confronting the ghosts of his past. "I've never held bitterness," Norris said, voice shaking. "Until now." The timing wasn't random. With his legacy on the line and time catching up, Norris admitted he felt compelled to set the record straight before it was too late. For years, fans had speculated about rumors of tension, unspoken rivalries, and backroom betrayals. But Chuck had stayed silent. Not anymore. What stunned people wasn't just the content, it was the tone. This wasn't anger. It was sorrow. Reflection. A man who spent a lifetime teaching respect through martial arts, now confronting moments when that respect was denied. He spoke with clarity and restraint. No theatrics, just truth. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about setting things right while I still can." And in that moment, the myth of Chuck Norris gave way to the man, vulnerable, weathered, and finally ready to tell the story that's been burning behind those famously steely eyes. The 5 actors named. In that same interview, Chuck Norris did what few expected. He named names. For decades, speculation had swirled. Who had crossed him? Who had drawn the ire of one of Hollywood's most disciplined icons? Now, the guessing was over. "This isn't petty," he said firmly. "These weren't misunderstandings. These were professional betrayals." He listed 5 actors, names that shook fans and headlines alike. Some were action stars, some from different corners of the industry. But the common thread, as Norris explained, was a violation of trust. He made it clear, this wasn't about ego. It was about values. Chuck Norris didn't mind competition. He didn't mind conflict. What he couldn't tolerate was disrespect behind closed doors, the kind that poisons reputations and sidelines careers. Each name came with a story, moments where trust was shattered and decorum thrown out the window. But he never raised his voice. He never lashed out. Instead, he drew a clear line between respect and retaliation. "I let a lot of things slide in my life, but these were different," he said. And with that, the man who once stayed quiet while others speculated now stood firm, his voice finally echoing louder than the rumors ever could. Early childhood and values. Long before the red carpets, movie sets, or martial arts tournaments, Chuck Norris was a shy kid from Oklahoma. Born March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, life didn't hand him strength. It made him earn it. His father battled alcoholism, and the home was often unstable. Norris, the eldest of 3 boys, became a quiet protector. reserved, observant, and already carrying the weight of others. "I wasn't strong. I was scared," he once admitted. "But I made a choice. I chose discipline." That choice changed everything. At 18, while serving in the U.S. Air Force, he was introduced to Tang Soo Do while stationed in South Korea. The moment he stepped onto the mat, he found something he'd never had before: structure, peace, and purpose. Martial arts gave him a code to live by: honor, humility, control. That code would follow him into adulthood, shaping not just his fights, but his friendships, and later, his feuds. He learned that real power doesn't come from winning. It comes from restraint. Norris would go on to win national titles, open karate schools, and build a name for himself, not by flash, but by discipline and respect. Those values, forged in hardship, would become the bedrock of every decision he made. And so, when Hollywood brought chaos, when fame brought betrayal, Norris didn't react like others might. He didn't punch back in public. He waited. And now, decades later, he's speaking from the same foundation he built as a boy: quiet strength, earned through pain. Mentoring Bruce Lee and Hollywood entry. Before Chuck Norris was a movie star, he was a fighter. But it was a fateful friendship in 1972 that shifted everything: Bruce Lee. The two met not in a studio, but on the mat. Sparring partners turned friends, they shared a deep mutual respect. Two men obsessed with discipline, precision, and the philosophy behind each move. Bruce wasn't just a fighter, he was a thinker, Norris recalled. He challenged how I viewed everything. Their showdown in Way of the Dragon became legendary, not just for its choreography, but for what it represented. East met West, respect met rivalry, and Norris, though technically the villain, emerged with a newfound legitimacy in the eyes of Hollywood. From there, he began transitioning into acting full-time. Good Guys Wear Black gave him his first starring role, and he ran with it. But it wasn't easy. He wasn't classically trained. Directors didn't know how to use him. Studios saw him as a fighter first, actor second. But that didn't bother him. He stuck to action roles that reflected his values, heroes who didn't brag, didn't break, and always had a code. "I didn't need to cry on screen to be real," he once said. "I needed to represent something solid." And that choice made him a force. Not the loudest man in the room, but the one people watched. Quiet, focused, unshakable. Walker, Texas Ranger. Peacekeeper. By the early 90s, Chuck Norris had already carved out his place in action cinema. But it was Walker, Texas Ranger that cemented his cultural icon status. Airing from 1993 to 2001, the show didn't just showcase martial arts. It showed America a hero who stood for law, honor, and unshakable moral clarity. In an era of anti-heroes, Norris gave audiences something different: a peacekeeper with principles. Cordell Walker didn't shoot first or grandstand. He listened. He acted when necessary, and always by the book. "There's justice in every kick, respect in every line," Norris once said about the role. But even as the show became a hit, controversy bubbled beneath the surface. Some writers wanted grittier storylines, more blood, more flash. Norris pushed back. He believed violence should serve a lesson, not a spectacle. The disagreements stayed mostly behind the scenes, but the tension was real. Norris, ever the peacekeeper, tried to bridge gaps. Still, he never let the show compromise his values. Off-screen, he remained just as composed. While Hollywood bickered and egos clashed, Norris kept his distance. He wasn't in it for tabloid fame. He was in it to tell stories that meant something, to reflect the discipline and respect that had shaped his life. And though the industry sometimes misunderstood him, audiences didn't. Week after week, millions tuned in not just to watch him fight, but to watch him stand for something. Seeds of the Feud. First incident. The first crack in Chuck Norris's armor didn't happen in a tabloid or a TV studio. It happened quietly, on set, in the early 1980s. He doesn't name the movie, but he remembers the moment with painful clarity. An actor he considered a colleague, even a friend, leaked damaging comments to the press. "I tolerated it until it turned personal," Norris said, his voice steady but wounded. The betrayal wasn't just about gossip, it was about trust. The comments weren't criticisms of his acting, they were jabs at his character, whispered behind his back, and then handed to reporters. For a man raised on discipline, whose entire public persona was built on honor, control, and humility, this was a line crossed. Still, in typical Chuck Norris fashion, he didn't explode. He didn't call out names. He handled it quietly, choosing calm over chaos. But he never forgot it. "You learn a lot in silence," he explained. "Who's real? Who's watching you? Who's waiting to see if you'll fall?" That first slight didn't break him, but it planted something. A seed of mistrust. A quiet warning. Not everyone in Hollywood plays by the same code. And from that point forward, he watched more carefully. The man who had once approached every set with openness and camaraderie started setting boundaries. Because in Chuck's world, respect wasn't optional. It was the only currency that mattered. Feud escalation in the 2000s. By the time the early 2000s rolled around, Chuck Norris was a household name. But with fame came public appearances, and one in particular, an industry dinner, became the moment the feud went from quiet frustration to something unforgettable. That night, Norris sat among peers when two fellow actors publicly mocked him. They didn't name him directly, but their jokes were unmistakably about him. They ridiculed his acting, his values, and his image as a morality man in a room full of industry insiders. Norris heard every word. "They weren't just mocking me," he said. "They were mocking what I stood for." At first, he said nothing. He finished his dinner, shook hands, smiled for photos, but later that night, word spread. People started whispering about the moment, and some even added fuel to the fire with their own stories. Rumors twisted truth, and the humiliation lingered. Norris didn't confront them. That wasn't his way. But internally, he drew a new line. The private irritations had now become a public disrespect, and that was something he could no longer ignore. "There's honor in discipline," he said, "but there's a point where silence feels like surrender." From that night forward, Chuck Norris began pulling back. From collaborations, from events, from people he once trusted. The martial artist who had taught peace now felt pushed into protection mode, not just for his reputation, but for his principles. Clash with Jean-Claude Van Damme. Of all the names mentioned in Chuck Norris's sit-down, the most shocking was one fans had long speculated about: Jean-Claude Van Damme. Their history goes back to the 1980s, when the martial arts world was small, tight-knit, and full of rising stars. They first met at an event, shared training spaces, even talked about working together. There was mutual admiration, until there wasn't. "At first I thought we had a lot in common," Norris admitted. But it changed. By the early 2000s, their camaraderie had faded. and so had the trust. According to Norris, Van Damme backed out of a project last minute, leaving the crew and Chuck hanging. But the real betrayal came not in the business deal, but in how Van Damme carried himself. Undisciplined, Norris said bluntly, unreliable, and that breaks the martial arts code. What made the fallout permanent wasn't anger, it was disappointment. Chuck had believed in Van Damme's talent. He respected his physical skill, but the way he moved in the industry, with ego, not honor, left a lasting scar. They never worked together again, never spoke publicly. Until now. "I never wanted a feud," Chuck said. "But when someone betrays the very discipline we both claim to honor, I can't forget that." It was never about showboating. It was about integrity. Something Chuck believes can't be faked, even on camera. Seagal Showdown, another long-standing source of tension. Steven Seagal, a martial artist turned actor whose career often paralleled Chuck's, but whose philosophy did not. The conflict started quietly in the late 1980s when Seagal began openly disrespecting American martial artists, even Bruce Lee. Chuck was stunned and offended, not just because Lee had been a friend and mentor, but because those comments dismissed the very culture that had raised them both. "He called our training weak, said Bruce wasn't the real deal," Chuck recalled. "That crossed every line I had." Norris's inner circle took it seriously. They issued what they called a cleanup challenge, not a fight, but a professional sparring invitation. Seagal never accepted. The tension never turned violent, but it never faded either. Seagal backed off, went quiet, and the confrontation stayed unspoken, but unforgettable. Chuck later summed it up best. It wasn't about violence, it was about principles. And in Chuck's world, principles always outweigh pride. Though they were never cast opposite each other and never shared a red carpet. The rift between them became a quiet standoff. Honor versus arrogance. And Chuck never flinched. Alec Baldwin. Moral standoff. Chuck Norris's feud with Alec Baldwin was never personal. Until it was. It started with politics. Baldwin, known for his sharp tongue and satire, had taken to late-night shows in the 2000s with jokes that Chuck felt mocked not just him, but the American values he stood for. "There's a difference between comedy and contempt," Chuck said, and what he saw in Baldwin's monologues? Disrespect disguised as entertainment. The final straw came in a televised speech where Baldwin referenced red state heroes with cowboy complexes. To Chuck, that wasn't satire. It was a shot fired straight at him. Norris went public, calling it a disrespectful misfire, and labeling Baldwin as part of the Hollywood elite lacking respect for everyday Americans. Baldwin never responded, but the silence spoke volumes. For Chuck, it wasn't about who was right or wrong politically. It was about tone. "You can disagree," he said, "but don't dishonor people who still believe in loyalty, family, and discipline." He never confronted Baldwin face to face, but the divide was drawn deep, and to this day, the moral standoff remains unresolved. In Chuck's world, criticism is fine, but mockery of values crosses a line. And with Baldwin, that line was crossed, and never uncrossed. Clash with Shia LaBeouf. By the late 2010s, Chuck Norris wasn't seeking conflict, but conflict found him again, this time in a much younger co-star, Shia LaBeouf. The two worked briefly on a commercial project, and from the beginning, Norris says, something felt off. LaBeouf was erratic, unfocused, and prone to sudden mood swings on set. Chuck, who built his career on precision, timing, and respect, struggled to connect. It wasn't about age, he said. It was about attitude. Norris never addressed it publicly until years later, when fans noticed a cryptic quote posted to his official Facebook page: "Fame without discipline is chaos." Speculation erupted. Many assumed it was directed at Shia, who at the time was in the middle of several legal controversies. Chuck never confirmed it directly, but in his 2025 interview, he acknowledged the tension. "Some people bring talent, others bring turbulence. I don't have time for the second." He stopped short of calling it a feud, but the message was clear. Norris didn't tolerate ego without foundation. He didn't hold LaBeouf responsible for being young or famous, but for ignoring the very principles that make greatness sustainable: humility, control, and discipline. Still, Chuck made it clear, this wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about drawing lines and protecting a legacy that had taken a lifetime to build. Turning point: public forgiveness. In his deeply emotional 2025 interview, Chuck Norris did something no one saw coming. Not fans, not critics, not even some of the people he called out by name. After walking us through decades of backstage betrayals, bruised friendships, and silent standoffs, the man once known for his unshakable toughness paused and chose something even harder than confrontation. He chose forgiveness. "I'm ready to forgive," he said softly. His voice didn't crack, but there was weight in every syllable. It wasn't a soundbite. It wasn't a press move. It was a man in his 80s, looking back on a lifetime of conflict, choosing to lay down the emotional armor he'd carried for far too long. But he was careful to draw a line. "I'm not erasing the past," he clarified. "I'm not pretending it didn't hurt." The scars were still there, both personal and professional. But at this stage in life, with a family he adores, a legacy already written in stone, and a soul rooted in principle, Chuck made a conscious decision: peace over resentment. "I won't forget," he said, "but I can release the anger." It wasn't a dramatic headline. There were no fiery sound effects or clickbait-ready moments. Instead, it was quiet, real, the kind of moment that doesn't break the internet, but builds character, the kind that resonates in living rooms and dojo mats more than red carpets. Norris made it clear this moment wasn't about revenge or reputation. He wasn't trying to embarrass the men who wronged him or rewrite the story. It was about teaching. It was about modeling what real strength looks like when the cameras are off. Now a grandfather many times over, Chuck often speaks to his grandkids not about glory or grudges, but about character. About the value of walking away with your dignity intact. "They don't need to know who I fought," he said. "They need to know what I stood for." To him, the past feuds were just life lessons in disguise, and if sharing them helps one young person choose restraint over retaliation, then the interview was worth it. "I didn't speak to settle scores," he said. "I spoke to teach." And in doing so, the man once feared for his fists became revered for something far more difficult to master: forgiveness. Because true strength isn't measured by how hard you hit. It's measured by how gracefully you let go. And that, Chuck Norris now believes, is the final belt you earn, not with power, but with peace. Legacy message. As Chuck Norris closes the final chapter of his storied life in the public eye, he leaves behind far more than martial arts victories, box office hits, or viral memes. What he's really passing down is a code of living, a blueprint for strength that begins not in the fists, but in the heart. "Discipline and respect outlast fame," he said. "Fame fades. Values don't." For nearly 6 decades, Norris built a reputation not just for his on-screen toughness, but for the quiet moral force behind it. His story isn't about Hollywood glitz or ego-driven rivalries. It's about how to stand tall in a world that constantly tries to knock you down, silently, humbly, and with dignity. In finally addressing the feuds and fractures that spanned decades, Norris wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was offering clarity, a final accounting of where he stood and why. The conflicts he opened up about don't define his legacy. Instead, they highlight the convictions he refused to compromise. He stood for honor, even when it cost him roles. He stood for fairness, even when others played dirty. And he stood for humility, even when he was the biggest name in the room. Now, as a mentor to the next generation, he shares more than fight techniques. He shares wisdom, reminding younger stars to slow down, train harder, speak less, and listen more. In a culture built on noise and attention, Norris believes true strength is silent. He often says, "Treat your words like punches, measured, disciplined, and only thrown when necessary." Even as his body aged, the principles never wavered. He didn't chase plastic youth or tabloid glory. Instead, he leaned into what made him different: integrity, patience, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. Chuck Norris never had to prove he was tough. The world already believed that. But by opening up, by telling his truth without bitterness, he proved something infinitely more rare in the entertainment world. He had nothing to hide. He walked through betrayal without vengeance. He faced aging without fear. He spoke truth without arrogance. And through it all, he remained what few in Hollywood ever become: a man you could trust. And with one final breath of quiet reflection, he left us with a quote that could hang in every dojo, school, or heart that's ever been tested. "You can't kick morality, only back it." That's the real Chuck Norris, not the myth, not the meme, just the man, still standing, still teaching, still fighting for what's right. And that may be the strongest legacy of all. Chuck Norris didn't speak to shame. He spoke to teach. His feuds weren't about ego, but about honor. And his final message rings louder than any roundhouse kick: fame fades. Values don't. At 82, he's still fighting. Only now, it's for truth, dignity, and peace. That's the real Chuck Norris.